norms against misusing this legislation were enforced during the Nehruvian period. There was a belief that political codes of conduct were such that you would not misuse the Preventive Detention Act, you would not misuse the First Amendment against freedom of speech. What becomes clear is that Indian institutions were very, very weak almost from the outset. In all of these periods, we saw enormous efforts being made to anchor institutions, to give some depth to institutions, to try to promote the constitutional agenda of equality. Patel, for example, said he didn't sleep for 3 days before the preventive detention legislation was brought by him. It was meant to last 1 year. One by then Law Minister Shanti Bhushan, that any attempts to change or restrict fundamental rights must be put to public referendum nationwide, in which over 50% of the people would have to vote. I would remind you of the movement in the early 1980s, in which 17 chief ministers came together to talk about the need to federalize India further.
Again, I won't venture to introduce Radhakumar because that has already been done. I would again recommend her latest work, The Republic Relearned. I think you have a copy with you. Renewing Indian Democracy. Again, I'll make 2 points. On December 26th of last year, there was a function organized in Bihar to commemorate the late Indian Prime Minister Vajpayee's death anniversary. There, the Ramdun was played. Ramdun is Mahatma Gandhi's favorite bhajan. And when this folk singer Devi, she came to this line. What is that line? Ishwar Allah. When it stopped with Allah, people objected to the naming of Allah. In a public space, in a public speech, in a public moment, in 2024, in our secular democracy. Now, even to me, even more shocking was that there was this former minister in the first Modi cabinet called Ashwini Kumar Choube. He was there. Till today, neither has he apologized, nor has any of this present cabinet apologized. They should apologize to the nation, am I right? And even more shocking to me is the fact, again I'll connect it with Radhakumar's book, where she says something very pertinent about the media. She calls it the fan media. The media today is not, as Zoya ma'am was saying, it has ceded its duty of questioning authority, of holding authority to truth. And she also pays compliments to the unseen presence of civil society. In fact, that is one of the greatest things that worked in the last elections. It's not the mainstream media, which was nowhere to be there. And Radhakumar also says that the media has been weakened. Now, the lexicon of anti-Nazism has given us this phrase in German. It's called, pardon my German, I don't know, I checked with a couple of my friends. It's called Voraussschauender Gehorsam. In English, it translates as obedience that leaps ahead. I was discussing with Professor Vijay Kumar. The adequate Malayalam would be Anusarana Seelam Munbe Chadunna Anusarana Seelam. You anticipate obedience. Nobody teaches you to be obedient. You anticipate that you have to be obedient. That's what the media does now. And I think that is one point that this book makes. And thank you very much for coming here. With that, I'll cede again the space and the stage to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive introduction. I would like Professor Hassan, like to thank the speaker and the Kerala Legislature for inviting me to this literary festival. May I also say that, to my knowledge, this may be the first legislature, certainly in this country, possibly in the world, to host a literary festival. And I'm not aware of a speaker actually sitting through sessions of a literary festival before, so doubly complimented this legislature. Professor Hassan has described the extremely depressing situation that we live in today in our country. I should confess that I began work on this book on renewing Indian democracy partly because I was so depressed. So I wanted to go to the history of India since independence to see, are there moments of hope and indeed ideas that have been expressed in our history that would be of use for us today. And I found several points. First of all, that, I was one of the generation born in the 1950s that always thought that we had had an unbroken democracy until the emergency, that the emergency was the major failure in our otherwise unbroken record. When I looked, however, what I saw was that after the founding years, we have had much longer periods of what is called democratic decay, the decay of democratic institutions, of democratic political cultures, and of democratic norms in the economy. Those periods added up to more than 36 years of our independent history, whereas I also then found that we had had 3 waves of democratic renewal in our country. One, obviously, the first obviously was after the emergency, the period 1977 to 1980. The next was the period from 1988-89 to 1998 or so, when again you had first a series of coalition Janata Party-led administrations, and then a Congress party led by a non-Gandhi prime minister. And then the third period was the Manmohan Singh period, the UPA period of 2004 to 2014. In all of these periods, we saw enormous efforts being made to anchor institutions, to give some depth to institutions, to try to promote the constitutional agenda of equality, and indeed to free the media from state control, including far more opportunity for dissent, for criticism, and so on. However, 2 or 3 points actually emerge even from these 3 waves of renewal. First of all, what becomes clear is that Indian institutions were very, very weak almost from the outset, including, of course, the media. But the media's independence actually came very late in the day. It was the mid-1980s before you started to see the emergence of independent electronic media, for example. Ironically, at the same time, what you saw was the decline in the print media, which did have some independence during the Nehru period. So the second point about the weakness of institutions is a point that Sudhir actually brought up, which is our instinctive self-censorship, the habit of obedience, as he called it, bhakti worship, as Ambedkar called it, and many others. This habit of seeing where authority wants to go and attempting to follow it. There have been many analyses of why this is. Sociologists mostly agree that it also is related to years and years of imperialism and colonialism. However, whatever the analysis or explanation of this is, the fact remains that it is a problem that needs to be tackled by Democrats today, in particular, especially given that our founding constitution was based on the idea that political leaders would seek to not only represent but fulfill the aspirations of their people. So there was an implicit, assumed code of conduct by which politics would be conducted. As a result of that, freedoms that needed to have been anchored constitutionally were not anchored constitutionally. For example, as you are all aware, the Preventive Detention Act was passed even before the Constitution was adopted. And by the way, it was passed because of communist strikes and unrest across the country. So it was passed as a way of suppressing unrest back in 1950. You see also the First Amendment to the freedom of speech being passed very soon after the Constitution is adopted. Here again, you can understand the reasons why this is happening. The problem is that norms against misusing this legislation were enforced during the Nehruvian period. There was a belief that political codes of conduct were such that you would not misuse the Preventive Detention Act, you would not misuse the First Amendment against freedom of speech. However, the recognition that merely allowing that opportunity for a determined government was wrong in itself, that recognition, which was expressed many times in the Constituent Assembly debates, in which people argued, for example, that preventive detention could only be exercised during times of war, as in other democracies, that it could not be used for internal unrest or for political unrest or for labor unrest, for that matter. These opinions were expressed, but sadly, they did not manage to circumvent this act. The same thing you see on the First Amendment. You see in particular socialist and communist members of the Constituent Assembly and of the Provisional Parliament speaking up, saying that this should not be acceptable. In both cases, one of the things that allowed either the Constituent Assembly members or the elected legislatures to go along with this was the understanding that these were temporary measures. Patel, for example, said he didn't sleep for 3 days before the preventive detention legislation was brought by him. It was meant to last 1 year. It just kept being extended over and over and over again. It came up again as an issue during the first phase of democracy renewal, when people said it should be repealed, including, by the way, the communist legislators at that time. It was not repealed. It was given yet another extension. As we know, now a whole slew of other draconian legislations, such as the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act and the new criminal and civil code that has been passed by the Modi administration, which, by the way, is far more draconian than any of the previous legislation that existed before. It gives far greater powers to the police to act without magisterial consent. It gives far greater periods of detention as legitimate, up to, I believe, 3 months. And so it has struck again at the roots of our fundamental rights. Now, let me quickly come to the kinds of proposals that were made during these 3 waves of democracy renewal and why I feel that they are relevant today. First of all, in the 1977 to 1980 period, 2 absolutely critical proposals were made. One by then Law Minister Shanti Bhushan, that any attempts to change or restrict fundamental rights must be put to public referendum nationwide, in which over 50% of the people would have to vote. To that was an addition by the then Communist Party of India Marxist, which proposed that any attempts to alter or dissipate federal rights and the basic structure of the Constitution should also be put to public referenda. This should be added. Here are two proposals. They were not, unfortunately, taken up. However, it seems to me that this is a moment when it's absolutely critical to start discussing these proposals again. At a time when fundamental rights have been so eroded, and when you see serious attacks undermining what federal structure there is in this country, and as you are all aware, this is not a very strong federal structure. The hope was always that this structure would federalize more, and indeed you saw at least some elements of fiscal federalism coming in from the Vajpayee period through to the Manmohan UPA 1 period. That has been taken away already. The share of states' rights in the finances is much lower today than it was 10 years ago. 40% to 32%, that kind of difference. You also see, of course, that increasingly the power of states to raise taxes, to subsidize welfare activities has been reduced by the union administration taking more and more taxes as cesses, which go directly to the center. And so again, you see a process whereby the rights of states to benefit their own people are one by one being attacked. Professor Hassan spoke of the example of Jammu and Kashmir, and here you had, of course, one of the most shocking assaults on federal rights. The way in which autonomy was removed was by putting almost 6,000 people in jail. All the political leadership, all the party cadre, all the dissidents, many journalists, many grassroots activists, all put in prison preemptively to prevent any outcry against the removal or the hollowing out of Article 370. Not only that, you see for the first time in the history of India, a state being demoted to a union territory and then divided into two union territories. This has never happened before in the history of this country, and in fact, the Constitution gives protection to states against any central attempt to demote them or to impose direct rule upon them. By the way, a series of other very important proposals was made again in the early 1970s by Tamil Nadu's Rajamannar committee, which suggested that the powers to declare internal emergencies had to be removed, that this should be something that would come from the state, not from the center and from the president, Article 356. Many very, very important proposals on the role of the governor, starting with Patel suggesting that the governor should be elected, to the Rajamannar committee, suggesting that governors should be nominated by the Legislative Assembly or even elected by the Legislative Assembly, so that the union administration did not have a role in choosing the governor. Again, extremely important today given the way that governors are misusing their mandates to interfere in the task of the elected administration. Now, the second set of proposals that I found extremely useful was the question of state rights and states' representation. One of the problems, as we know, in this country is that the upper house, the Rajya Sabha, is also, seats are allocated on a proportional basis to states, just as in the Lok Sabha they are allocated proportional to population. This has become a very important issue in the context of the forthcoming delimitation of 2026. The southern states, which have actually done extremely well in terms of population control and welfare for their people, but are facing the problem of a declining population, this has become now a big issue. Because as we know, the northern states are, and some of the eastern states are far more populous, and their population is growing, not declining. This was an issue that came up again, right back at the time of the States Reorganization Committee, when Ambedkar had proposed that UP, for example, should be divided into three. Partly because by virtue of size and by virtue of population, it then, without it being divided, it commanded far too determining a position in the legislature. This proposal was taken up by Mayawati, for example. Even the Congress at one point had spoken of the division of UP. However, we know very well that there are this is not going to be an issue that political parties are going to espouse, or certainly not UP-based political parties or national political parties, because there are too many seats at stake over there. So, putting aside perhaps that question of whether you talk about dividing states to make them more equal in terms of territory as well as population, you can go to another. Look at the possibility, and this proposal came up again in the 1970s, look at the possibility for states to have equal representation in the Rajya Sabha. This again was something that the Rajamanar Committee as well discussed. Here, that then will become a safeguard for the states. If they have an equal number of seats, irrespective of population size, in the Rajya Sabha, then the interests of all states can be fairly represented in the union legislature, and what's more, decision-making can become a far more equitable, deliberative process, i.e. one in which you have wide-ranging discussion. Finally, let me come to questions of freedom of speech and dissent. As I've mentioned, the repeal of Preventive Detention Act came up in Parliament several times during the first wave of democracy renewal, during the second wave of democracy renewal, and during the third wave of democracy renewal. It was not accepted then, it certainly won't be accepted now. So the question for civil society, I would say, or for those who believe deeply that this legislation and similar legislations must be repealed, the question comes, is it something that states can start to initiate? Could state legislatures discuss the unconstitutionality and indeed the repressive nature of such legislations, and say that they would wish, A, to withdraw their consent to such legislation in their state, B, perhaps lead movements to bring the issue back to national parliament and to talk again about repealing it? Are these issues that should be a part of states' rights? I would argue they should. If there is a state whose people actually really believe that the preventive detention legislation should go, then the state legislature should represent the views of those people. And that has to become an issue of discussion for the union administration as well. However, to go one step further, I would remind you of the movement in the early 1980s, in which 17 chief ministers came together to talk about the need to federalize India further. By the way, that was one reason that Farooq Abdullah was cast into oblivion by the Congress party, because he hosted these 17 chief ministers. As you recall, Jyoti Basu was one of the main leaders of this federalism front, if I may call it that. Here again, we have an absolutely dire need for states to come together, to start talking about federal rights in a way that is essential. Finally, let me talk about civil society. One of the things that came out very clearly in all three waves of democracy renewal is that it was civil society groups and movements that actually spurred the way for a change in dispensation, for the overthrow of the more authoritarian government. However, what was also equally noticeable, barring a few exceptions, was that then civil society groups did not find their views or their proposals being taken up in a big way by the newly elected administration. This is a gap that has been noted, I think, time and time and time again, certainly from the 70s onwards. And it is an important question: what role should civil society have in at least monitoring implementation of proposals that have come from it? Take, for example, the Bhopal gas tragedy. The VP Singh's Janta administration was extremely kind to us on that. I was one of the people involved in campaigning around that issue. They did reopen the case against Union Carbide. They did provide government maintenance for a period until the Carbide settlement was renegotiated. In fact, they had the Attorney General take up the case, and then Mr. Soli Sorabji was the Attorney General prior to his becoming a little close to the BJP much later. And he involved us in the case. So we were actually part of the government team arguing against Carbide. However, what didn't happen was that the survivor organizations on the ground in Bhopal, they were not empowered to be able to monitor and check and oversee how the compensation was distributed, what was to be done on medical relief and treatment, or for that matter, on the removal of the toxic waste. As you see, this has now become an issue again. And now, how many years later? Almost 40 years later, the removal of the toxic waste is beginning. It has gone to a certain point, not beyond. So I would flag this point for anyone from civil society groups over here, that it is really important to engage with political parties in order to also set up institutions where elected administrations, or institutional mechanisms, where elected administrations work with civil society on issues that civil society have brought to their attention. Finally, the last point, since we are here in a legislative assembly building, something that I noticed, and a point that has been made by a very fine former Supreme Court Judge, Madan Lokur, is that if you look at the composition of the Union Parliament during first the Constituent Assembly debates and the Nehru period, you see that there is a high proportion of constitutional experts in the legislature. This, you will notice, I'm sure, has almost come to a zero. Very, very, very few constitutional experts are in Parliament today, not even nominated to the Rajya Sabha. One or two party members perhaps, but that's it. However, the problem with that is that you will always then create legislation which is open to misuse because you don't have the constitutional experts with the legal background to talk about safeguards. How do you safeguard a legislation in such a way that it cannot be misused against dissenters, for example? That's something that any good lawyer could tell you, but you need to have him or her there. The second point, the first Janta Morarji Desai administration, which actually perhaps came out with the most wide-ranging set of proposals for administrative reform and egalitarianism that we have ever seen. You know, the very first police reform commission reports, the very first administrative reform commissions were set up during this period. And again, please note, none of the stronger recommendations in any of those have actually ever been adopted or implemented. Again, an agenda that is awaiting. However, what was interesting about the composition of that parliament is that it had a large number of media people in it. It had actually civil society activists, and it also had farmers' representatives. So it was a very different composition of a legislature. Now the question comes, would we consider, I speak now as a civil society person myself, my ideal legislature would be one which would have a wide representative composition, but which would also have the required expertise when it comes to drafting legislation. Not one that merely sends to parliamentary committees, which tend to be extremely opaque in my experience. But one that will actually ensure that those parliamentary committees are based on expert knowledge, analysis, data collection. Again, something that we are not doing today. If you look at the kind of materials that parliamentary committees look at, it's pathetic, absolutely pathetic. Any university department could tell you more than these parliamentary committees know or access. So to end over there, here is a series of proposals that have come out of our own history during our waves of democracy renewal. And I would urge very strongly that all of us pay serious attention to at least 3 or 4 of them. The ones on referenda and fundamental rights, the ones on repeal of draconian legislation, and the ones on federal rights and federal representation. These are 3 areas that are critical if we want to save our democracy today. And I hope very much that we can do more together on that. Thank you.